Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Brussels Signal podcast. It is a great pleasure that I can introduce you today to Dr. Benedict Beckeld, a writer, philosopher, and academic who proves once again the point that one does not have to spend a lot of time on Twitter or X to be a truly great thinker. Actually, I start to increasingly believe that the less time people spend on social media, the smarter they are. And Benedict is a wonderful example of this. Benedict, if you wouldn't mind, in a few sentences, could you introduce us to yourself and what you're currently up to, what your main projects are at the moment? And then I'm very much looking forward to one particular topic that you're working on, and that is the concept of oikophobia and the self-hatred of the West. You've also written in 2022 an excellent book on the issue that was published by Cornell University Press, which I highly recommend to all our viewers and listeners. You appeared on fantastic podcasts. You were on with Victor Davis Hanson. You were on the Lotus Eaters. So you're both a prolific writer. You're on with Peter Boghossian. So you have spoken to quite a number of the most relevant thinkers today, and I would count you among them as well. So I'm very much looking forward to your take on the concept of oikophobia. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself just in a few sentences, because, as I said, you're so underrepresented on social media that it's probably very hard for many of the people who enjoy your work to find you.
So thank you. And you're right. Yeah, this is actually a bit of it's something that I've struggled with myself, because precisely as you say, one has to be present on social media to sort of put one's work out there. But as you say, it tends to interfere with the process of one's thinking and so on. So it's one is between a rock and a hard place there. But yeah, so I'm a philosopher, as you mentioned. I was trained academically, mostly in Germany, actually, at the University of Heidelberg, where I got my PhD in philosophy and classical philology. And but I'm an American citizen, and I live here in New York City. But so what I'm working on right now is, so you mentioned oikophobia. This has been my work that's been going on for many years, and that culminated, as you mentioned, in my book Western Self-Contempt, which came out a couple of years ago. But I've continued to write on that subject, or in terms of various articles and so on that involve the subject and where the United States and Europe are heading in terms of their cultural self-hatred, which is what oikophobia means. So this has been a lot of my work. Right now, I'm actually working. My newest book project is actually more in the field of aesthetics, which was one of my early, which was my first love, really, in philosophy. But it also involves how aesthetics and how our views of art and so on tie into political philosophy as well. And what it says about us as a society. But yeah, so oikophobia is the most crucial, or one of the most crucial key terms to understand if one wants to know what is happening right now with the West and with Western Europe and the United States in particular.
So in layman's terms, how would you describe oikophobia to a general audience, like somebody who is not trained in philosophy, who is not trained in political thought? What would be the way in which you would describe it?
Yeah, so oikophobia, literally the fear of home, or the hatred of home, as you might sometimes translate it, is essentially what happens to a modern Western culture. It has also happened to antiquity, but to an advanced Western culture that starts to turn inward, and instead of being focused on external enemies or external threats, it basically starts to view itself in the mirror, and it starts to question itself. And that self-questioning, which can, of course, also be a good thing, but that self-questioning eventually tips over into outright self-contempt and self-hatred. And so oikophobia is where we find ourselves right now, and it has happened again in history. It happens under certain socio-historical circumstances. One can trace it back all the way to ancient Greece. But right now, we find ourselves in the grip of oikophobia, more extremely so in Western Europe than in the United States, but it's certainly also a big problem, of course, here in the United States, as I think everybody can see, with large segments of our populace hating America, with a lot of Americans hating the United States and thinking that the United States is the fount of all evil and everything like that. That is basically what oikophobia means. And so it's interesting to study and to understand why this actually happens in history, because then, of course, we start to understand what can be done about it as well.
Can you explain to us a little bit how you came to think about this? Because your book was published in 2022, but this, of course, means that you wrote and thought about this issue at least, I would say, 5 years or a decade before that. I mean, now I think you described this absolutely correctly. We see now, the burning of American flags and kind of the general condemnation in the United States, but also in Europe of our own history. But it's easy to say that oikophobia is happening now that we see it with our own eyes. But you kind of caught on to that topic. You were ahead of the curve already a decade ago. So how did it happen that you sensed the evidence for this is happening, or that you sensed that something was building up in the realm of oikophobia?
Yeah. So you're right. As you know yourself, academic publishing tends to be a very slow process. So if something comes out in 2022, it means one has been working on it for many, many years before. So what happened, and I'm sure I'm far from the only one, basically, I actually describe it a little bit also in the book itself, but not too much. It basically just started as personal observations and noticing this sort of knee-jerk reaction, especially in academia, of course, because that is where these things tend to be centered, but then also in society at large, about how people would just assume that the United States was the worst in the world, or that Europe was the worst in the world. It was a sort of something that people just assumed without even thinking about it, and it was very noticeable. So I started thinking about this. It was in the late 2000s, actually, that it started to sort of crystallize in my mind, if you will. And then, of course, I came across this term, oikophobia itself, which was coined by Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton. He had coined it in the 90s, but he didn't write that much about it. He wrote an article about it, and then he had a book chapter in a book, which England and the Need for Nations, which came out in 2004. He dealt with it in a brief chapter, and so he was describing a concept that I had already noticed. And so I became interested in using this word and in just going a lot deeper and a lot further than he had done. And so I started writing about it. My first article on it came out in 2019 from Quillette. But then by the time I got the book out, as you said, it was 2022. It actually was helpful. Obviously, I wish that it hadn't happened, but as you can imagine, academic publishers, of course, they tend to not to want to publish anything that can be perceived as conservative or as even mildly right-wing. First, I had received a lot of no's from academic presses, and then actually the riots happened here in the United States in 2020. And by that time, I had already been in touch with several editors at various academic presses. And I had received a lot of no's, and then there was this one editor at Cornell, whom I then alerted. See, look at what's happening here. This is what I've been talking about, pointing at the riots and the graffiti on the statues of American founders and so on. This is what I've been talking about. I mean, this is the perfect illustration. And that actually, in a way, probably helped me a little bit in terms of the publishing process, because a lot of people sort of said, yeah, that's interesting. You may be onto something. And so obviously, which is not to say that I wish that it had happened, but then finally it saw fruition that way. Yeah.
Very often the phenomenon with oikophobia is described as something that comes from postmodernity, right? It's a postmodern phenomenon. Some people like James Lindsay would cite something that's out of Marxism, communism. But you hinted at something by saying that similar things happened in antiquity. So I think this would be an interesting way to look at this. So what parallels do you see? Or is it possible that kind of every civilization runs through a phase of postmodernity and then either find itself at renewal or at decline and disappearance? But I think the argument that we constantly think about ancient Rome is probably true, but when it comes to the very specific phenomenon of self-hatred, how would you make the comparison to antiquity? And how would you react to the claim that this is a kind of a Marxist communist phenomenon? Because this is something I'm not happy with, but I'd be very happy to hear and very interested to hear your take on this.
Yeah, the idea that it's not completely false, that, I mean, Marxism and postmodernity certainly have something to do with it. But it's more than that. So it would be more accurate to say, I think, that Marxism and postmodernity and the Frankfurt School, all of these sort of terms and movements and buzzwords that people like to use, they certainly play a part in it. And I trace that ideological thread, if you will, from Karl Marx through the Frankfurt School through certain French postmodernists up to the present day. That thread certainly can be established. But as you mentioned, it's something that happens to ancient civilizations as well. So it's more accurate to say that various, when a civilization goes through, approaches its oikophobic phase, it will find various ideologies to latch onto in order to advance oikophobia. So in ancient Greece, in late 5th century Athens, early 4th century Athens, relativism, the whole debate of nature versus law, right? The whole debate about convention versus absolute truth was in vogue, and so the whole idea of moral relativism was the philosophy by which a lot of people were able to latch on in order to advance oikophobia. And obviously we have a lot of relativists in that sense today as well. But so there will be individual variations from civilization to civilization. But the specific ideologies or the details of the specific ideologies will differ, yes. But it ultimately boils down to a very similar type of phenomenon. When it comes to ancient Rome was actually had somewhat less oikophobia. I talk a little bit about that in the book as well, than ancient Greece, because ancient Greece, and in particular Athens, was a much more open intellectual space for a particular period, at least for several decades of its existence, which was not quite the same. It wasn't that to the same extent in ancient Rome, and so the ancient Romans also had a much stronger sense of hierarchy and of patriarchality than the Greeks did. So that also served as a bulwark against oikophobia. But we see the same pattern develop in ancient Rome as well. So obviously there are many reasons why ancient Rome disintegrated. Oikophobia is only one of them. There are many others. But oikophobia still plays a role. One stops to believe in oneself. One stops believing in one's own gods, in one's own traditions, and so on. That's perfectly traceable in Rome as well. And so when you mention renewal and or collapse, collapse is the more, certainly in antiquity, collapse is the result, not renewal. Now, today in the modern world, we don't have Visigoths or Vandals about, crowding at our borders, about to invade us when we become oikophobic. So in that sense, we're not necessarily going to collapse, but we will sort of wither away and will become decreasingly relevant geopolitically. Now, of course, even though there are no Visigoths or Vandals or Ostrogoths and so on, there are still, of course, peoples in the world who think very differently from the way we do. And to some extent, the United States, but of course, in particular, Western Europe, is experiencing this in the sense that because it's less dramatic, obviously, than was the case in the Roman Empire, where you have actual armies crossing the borders and overwhelming Roman garrisons and so on. But in a less dramatic way, the same thing is playing out in Western Europe in the sense that with a lot of West Europeans no longer believing in their own culture, they are no longer willing to defend it before the waves of immigrants that are flooding their countries.
Do you think that in many ways some of the philosophies and ideologies we talk about today, that they are more a symptom than a cause? Like what you just described, for example. So you lose faith and trust in your own civilization, your own culture, and then you try to find something else to latch onto. So Marxism, wokeness, I think spirituality probably would also, and the day beyond this, that this is just a symptom of a population or of a civilization that no longer believes in its own past, so they try to find something else. And it's a little bit of a roll of a dice what that something else might be. Could we even say in a more provocative way that Christianity might not have been successful if Rome would have been more confident in its own beliefs and its own traditions and in its own culture? That in many ways it was a stroke of luck that Christianity then took over, but it probably could have been something else as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one sees that, so I guess I get to the first part of your question first, but basically it's a symbiotic relationship, I would say. So certainly it often happens, and one sees this, of course, in individual cases. It very often happens that it doesn't necessarily happen that someone is a staunch conservative and patriot and so on, and then suddenly comes across Das Kapital of Marx and becomes an oikophobe. Very often it's young, disillusioned people who already don't believe in anything, and then they find these ideologies to latch onto. Of course, that does happen a lot. And historically as well, I mean, one sees a weakening of the culture. It begins usually with a weakening of the religion. One no longer believes in God or the gods in ancient times. And then that opens up the space for these other ideologies to come in. And you mentioned spirituality and so on. One will often, before these things become crystallized in Marxism or postmodernism or whatever it may be, these things become codified by intellectuals, but before these things become codified by intellectuals, there is this sort of aimlessness and the replacement of traditional religion with various superstitions, with physiognomy and vegetarianism. Even that might sound provocative to some people, but that's a repetitive pattern as well, and so on. Pop spirituality, Eastern religions, Eastern cults. Buddhism would be the perfect example today. Other Eastern cults or Eastern religions in ancient times, they come in to fill the vacuum, and then various intellectuals crystallize these or make these various ideologies more concrete. So that's something. And then, of course, that further feeds Oikophobia once those things have been established. And so in that sense, I would say it's a symbiotic relationship. When it comes to Christianity in the Roman Empire, I think that's entirely right what you say. For a long time, and one sees this in various historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, sort of around 100 AD or so, before Christianity has made a lot of inroads, but already then there is a sort of mocking of religion, and Juvenal and Tacitus, they complain about how Roman women, they don't go to sacrifice to the traditional Roman gods. Rather, they go to Jewish soothsayers, which, of course, from the Roman perspective, is an Eastern cult or an Eastern religion. And then, of course, Christianity is the Eastern cult. Or the Eastern religion that ultimately proved successful. But yes, it's able to do that because by that time the groundwork has already been laid, or the Roman soil has become fertile for this kind of thing, because everything else has sort of been marginalized already. Yeah.
So now I have two questions, and I'm not sure which one to ask first. Maybe I can combine them.
Yes.
When would you say, I know this is not a precise science in this case, of course, but if you would have to put your finger on a date, when would you say approximately in the modern West did oikophobia start?
So it varies from country to country, and this is something I lay out a bit more in the book, because I have separate chapters for various countries. So it starts. Probably won't come as a surprise to a lot of people. It starts in France. In talking now about the modern world, of course, the French always have to be at the forefront of everything, for both good and bad. So it starts around the if we're going to talk about a date, mid 18th century. So basically with the Enlightenment, and with the Diderot, the Encyclopédie, and Condorcet, Voltaire, all those people. That's what it's sort of. That's now. Again, it doesn't arise ex nihilo, right? It doesn't come out of nothing. Before that time, religion has already started to be weakened. Atheism has already started to become more and more salonfähig, as we would say in German, has more and more acceptable, right? And the Catholics of France, for example, they hate Protestants more than they hate atheists. For example, they hate the Huguenots more than they hate freethinkers in their own midst. So already there is a weakening of religion going on in the early 18th century, before the Enlightenment has begun to arise. But to put a date on it, basically 1750s thereabouts in France. And then if you're going to look at other countries, now the French are at the forefront. If you look at Great Britain, we're talking more about the late 19th century. And there is a reason for this, right? Because when a civilization is at its peak in terms of power and geopolitical influence and so on, it still has a lot of confidence in itself, because it can see how it's laying waste, so to speak, to surrounding areas, or how it's dominating other areas. And for France, that is about the time. I mean, it's really Louis XIV, so that peak is a little earlier. But they're still sort of coming off that high, that civilizational high, if you will, by the time the 1750s come around. Similarly, in England, if one wants to put their civilization at a peak in terms of geopolitical influence and so on, it would basically be around the 1860s, thereabouts, 1870s maybe. And so one sees late 19th century, late Victorian England, that's where this starts to happen. One sees it especially with the Boer War, right? So right at the cusp of the turn of the century there, where more and more speeches come about that take the side of the Boers, and that say that the English are the bad guys and so on. And so that's later in England. And then again in the United States, it's even later, because again, we are sort of delayed, if you will, vis-a-vis Europe on that historical trajectory. Our peak here in the United States obviously comes after World War II, basically 1950s. And so our oikophobia sets in a little later. Now, of course, we are living in such an interconnected global world that whatever happens in Europe is going to reflect what happens in the United States and vice versa. So that gives the impression that all of the West became oikophobic around the same time, because we're all sort of this obsession with racism and with oppression from white males and so on. this is a discourse now that is taking place on both continents simultaneously. But in fact, the actual science of oikophobia, that's just the most modern expression of oikophobia. The earliest signs of oikophobia did arise at different moments in different countries. Yeah.
Do you think, would it be fair to say, or would it be too provocative to argue that kind of the catastrophe of World War I, ultimately broke the Whiggish interpretation of history, that things tend to always get better and that progress can never be stopped, and that also kind of shattered the self-confidence of Europe in particular, and that in some way, even Bolshevism, probably Bolshevism less so for different reasons we can probably go into, but that fascism, at least the Italian version, but maybe then also the German version in the form of National Socialism, that these were actually also kind of reactions to oikophobia in a sense. Kind of what you described early on, right? You had this emptying out of the confidence in the original structure of society and the system, and then some new ideas tried to take that place, and the kind of even fascism would fall into that category.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reaction to oikophobia. So yeah, World War I is. Yeah, I mean, as you imply, I think I would say World War I is the conflict from which Europe never recovered, basically, and in that sense, from a purely cultural point of view, it's actually more dramatic than World War II, even though, of course, in a purely physical sense, World War II was even worse. And the reaction that you find, this is why there is the reaction, and now the reaction takes many different forms. Obviously, the most extreme form of such a reaction is indeed obviously fascism, in particular the German form, but to some extent also the Italian form. What happens now, and of course by saying that I'm not drawing any parallel between the two, unlike what the left likes to do, but obviously Brexit and Trump and so on is also a reaction over here, although obviously it has ideologically practically nothing in common with fascism. But yeah, so those reactions definitely happen. Now, as you mentioned, oikophobia had already taken place, had already started before World War I, but certainly World War I is something that certainly gave rise, or not gave rise, but that was able to fuel oikophobia. And you have, I mean, I mentioned aesthetics in the beginning. That's something I'm working on. Obviously, the rise of Dada right after World War I, for example, that's a perfect example of that phenomenon. They react against World War I, which makes them react against the entire civilization that, in their eyes, produced World War I. And I would say that's a pretty major category error on the part of Dada, on the part of the Dada artists. But maybe that's a whole other story. But in any case, yeah. So it certainly fueled that, and the reaction that you mentioned then does happen, and the reaction can be either worse than the disease, or in some cases, as I would say in the case of the United States, better, a lot better than the disease. But yeah.
If we embed this concept of oikophobia in kind of the broader historical trajectory, that's of course a tricky question. But one argument, or one strong belief that even nowadays we seem to ascribe to is this idea, the search for truth, right? Kind of we want to find out what is objectively true. But if we look at the cultural civilizational development, both I guess in the West and outside of the West, do you think that Nietzsche got it right? And I'm simplifying here his perspective, but that at some point will matters more than truth. I mean, truth is there, of course, no doubt about this. But when it comes to social change is not necessarily driven by us figuring out, in ever greater detail how the world truly works. But it is that in history, time and again, small groups, individuals, charismatic individuals pop up, and they have the willpower then to kind of bend society, if you want, or bend the arch of history, at least temporarily, to their will, without glorifying it. But I think this is one of the big dilemmas here. Is it really truth and an ever better understanding of the objective forces of the world that drive history forward? Or is it the occasional rise of these movements, these figures that are not so much concerned about what is objectively true, but they have, as Nietzsche would say, a will to power? And this is something that we also see nowadays in many movements. So that very often the debate on, that one political movement says A, the other political movement says B, and the expectation is that whichever of those two positions is closer to the objective truth is the one that ultimately will be victorious. Or could it be the case that no, the position where those who believe in it are willing to do more, are willing to fight to the death, if you want, that's probably going to be a more decisive factor than whether or not it's objectively true?
Yes, I guess I would say two questions there, probably. So in terms of the importance of truth, with the importance of will rather than truth, yes. And I mean, this is something that, which I think also is a little bit embedded in your question, namely the idea that we are a little too obsessed with moral purism, certainly here in the United States. I mean, my current federal government is very obsessed with moral purism rather than with willpower. This is actually something that Trump understood a lot better, namely that he was much more of a realpolitik kind of a person and sort of a Machiavellian to some extent. I use that word cautiously, but that certainly is a lot more useful than the sort of moral purism that we see when it comes to what drives history. It's what I don't like about this sort of discussion when people argue about, the great man theory of history and the sort of the more deterministic view of history is that it tends to be a sort of a zero-sum game in this sort of discussion. And as I would say, as so many other things, it's a bit of both, I would say. I think the willpower of important men in history, and again, something one can say without making a moral judgment either way about them, that is certainly something that plays a role, but they're still hampered by what they can do by the circumstances in which they find themselves. I guess in that sense, I take a fairly Hegelian view. I don't consider myself Hegelian, but in the sense that there are certain historical moments or certain historical phases in which certain things are possible. And then you do have some kind of a great man, great quote-unquote man who seizes that moment and is able to take the possibilities of his historical moment to the fullest extent. But he can't do more than that. That is to say, he can't do more than what the historical circumstances will allow. That might sound almost tautological, but it's important to keep in mind in the sense that there are still, mass psychology is still an important factor. A great man can only do what mass psychology will allow him to do. And that is true. I mean, that's true for somebody like Napoleon. That's true for somebody like Trump, Julius Caesar, anyone that one can mention, Hitler too, for that matter. And so I see it as a little bit of both. But the devotion to truth. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but the whole idea of the arch of history bends towards justice or toward truth, everything like that. It's a load of nonsense in my view. We have to take a much more realistic view of things. And to use a bit Nietzschean language, since you mentioned him, we have to take a much more tragic view of history. We have to accept that there is no salvation, there is no messianic era or anything like that. You mentioned this sort of triumphant attitude that people had. One can talk about the triumphant attitude that people had at the end of the Cold War as well, which is the same kind of a mistake. The mistake that people made after the end of the Cold War was that they forgot the tragic view of history, which is to say that there's always going to be something that's going to come back, and there's always going to be some reason for us to watch our backs, so to speak, and to understand that if for a moment we believe that things are going to now remain as they are, and we'll be able to just enjoy the fruits of our labors and so on, that's the moment when the decline sets in. That's the moment when we open ourselves up to these new threats that we now see all around us. So, yeah.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And do you think that, because I think that dovetails nicely with what you just said, that one element, because you mentioned moral purism, that moral purism might on the outside seems like something that is very strong, but in fact that it is a sign of weakness. And what I mean by this is, if you're confident in your civilization, in yourself, you're probably much more capable of being pragmatic. Now, you mentioned somebody like Donald Trump, and I think this is for me always one of the most astounding character traits of Donald Trump. Now, he's definitely not a moral purist, but I think he's a very confident man. But that allows him, I believe, to be much more pragmatic than he gets credit for. I mean, if you look at things like his position on abortion or same-sex marriage or foreign policy, like the very fact that he has kind of as his guiding star, and I think that is a position he sincerely holds, that he is an American patriot, right? When he talks about making America great again, I think he really believes in the greatness of America, but he also sees, I think, as you mentioned or alluded to before, that in order to fulfill America's promise, sometimes you have to be a little bit pragmatic, in the same way as a Thomas Jefferson was, right? In the same way as a George Washington was. So kind of the baseline was strong confidence in in their whatever you want to call it, in their culture, their civilization, their country, but they were aware that you cannot treat it, as you mentioned, kind of from a purely morally puristic perspective. You have to be pragmatic, whether it's the Louisiana Purchase, whether it's the Monroe Doctrine, and also so you say you're isolationist, but you understand that sometimes you can't be, right? You say you're going to keep out of the dabblings of the European powers, but you know that sometimes you have to make deals with them. In the same way Trump does it. And very often it seems that when you look at wokeness, for example, right, that in fact it is so dominant in the discourse. But in fact, as an ideology, it almost strikes one as weak because it is so morally pure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think
it tends to be.
Yeah,
it
no, absolutely.
Tends to be morally pure.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And the connection that one can also make between them is essentially vanity, because and vanity is the vice that fuels both oikophobia and this moral purism, and that's why oikophobes tend to be the ones who are morally pure. Now, one can find different kinds of moral purity. Obviously, I don't want to say that it's a uniquely an oikophobic phenomenon. But the thing is, why does someone become an oikophobe? Well, then someone becomes an oikophobe because he thinks that he is better than his surrounding civilization. I understand, the oikophobe, I see how my civilization has gone wrong. I see the sins that it has committed, and I'm better than that. And now I set out to right those wrongs. And so I hate my own civilization. I despise it because it's evil. It has committed all of these crimes, and now we're going to do something better. So that's vanity that drives oikophobia. And that, of course, one can see how that relates very strongly to moral purism. Whereas someone who is not an oikophobe might say, okay, well, I don't necessarily say that everything that my civilization has ever done was morally good, but moral purism isn't the end all and be all. And so someone who is not a moral purist tends not to be oikophobic. And so that goes hand in hand. We see our current administration here in the United States is certainly very oikophobic, and it's also very morally purist. A lot of hand-wringing about the deaths in Gaza or what have you, about preaching to the Chinese about human rights over there, or preaching to all different kinds of countries around the world about trans rights and so on. Not realizing that all of these things, whether one is, regardless of what one may think about a particular issue, this sort of moral purism is not conducive to a sound geopolitics where you have to be a lot more pragmatic. So oikophobia and moral purism go hand in hand in that way, go very naturally hand in hand.
But do you think that this form of moral purism, that it has widespread appeal? Or do you think that very often it's presented by those who ascribe to it, like what you see also in the media, for example, that it is, because it is in many ways, I would argue, maybe not a radical, but it's a fringe position, but very often it strikes me as being represented as the centrist position. I mean, I find this surprising, just kind of when we go a little bit more into contemporary topics. Mm-hmm. But whatever one thinks about it, or whatever one thinks about transgender issues and all these kind of things, but it's very surprising. We saw this just a couple of hours ago, if you want, or days ago, where you have one presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, right, who does campaigning with drag queens, and then you have the vice presidential candidate in the form of J.D. Vance, who is, kind of this middle of the road, kind of mundane individual, married, 3 kids, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the media kind of is telling us that the kind of 1960s Family Guy is the weird person, whereas the drag queen, pride, progress, transgender individual is the centrist and the moderate one. As I said, whatever one thinks about these two positions, but it's very odd how the perception of what is a centrist and what is moderate has shifted as the position has shifted from what is actually extremes. Like very often, I think many positions that we see as extreme, at least in the public discourse, just a couple of years ago would have been entirely moderate, that many positions that are actually moderate are very often described as being extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean the arc of civilizational history bends toward progressivism, one can certainly say, and this is true again also in antiquity as in modern times. The fact that we always move, each Western civilization always moves in a progressive direction over time, and this is also why when people talk about the culture wars and are the conservatives or the progressives going to win the culture wars, the progressives always win the culture war. It's maybe not a very encouraging thought, but that is always what happens. And here in the United States, that resistance is still ongoing, whereas in Europe now it has mostly collapsed. Although one sees certain signs of a revivifying of certain resistance here and there. It's still quite weak, but we'll see how it continues. But the fact is that, I mean, if you look at various policies, how they develop, it's astounding how quickly it moves. But I mean, a Clinton Democrat, I mean, Bill Clinton, not Hillary, Bill Clinton in the 90s, he would be a moderate Republican today. I'm far from the first one to observe that, but that is how it is, basically. And so these things change very quickly, and they always change in the same direction. And moral purism feels good. It's a kind of a drug. I mean, it feels good to know that you're better than other people. And obviously, if you can say that, well, I'm surrounded here by these trans individuals, and I am taking care of the formerly oppressed, and so on, well, then I'm better than someone who doesn't do those things, supposedly, and that's what it is. It's moral purism and vanity is basically well, they're two sides of the same coin.
I mean, I would even go a step further. I think probably even FDR and Harry Truman would be Republicans these days. I mean, many of the
Truman would
positions.
Truman would be like a hardcore. He would be like from Mississippi, Bible thumping. Yeah, absolutely. Which is why, by the way, Truman is my favorite Democrat president of the 20th century. Maybe no.
All right, good to know.
Maybe no coincidence, but yeah.
I mean, do you think there is because you said in the end in the culture wars the progressives always tend to win, but. Yeah. I'm always wondering what do you believe is driving this? Because one thing that surprises me is, say whatever you want about the progressives or the left, I always feel that at least they have a complete vision, if you want. Whatever one thinks about that vision, whether one shares it or one rejects it, but they set the terms on which the cultural conversation takes place, and if you want to call it the right or the counter progressive culture, whatever term you want to use. They always play on by their rules. They always play on their fields, and I wonder why is that? I mean, what do you think? How would you explain that so many things that you just described that seemed entirely normal just a couple of decades ago are now seen as the extremist position or the non-moderate position, if you want?
Yeah, I mean, it's a loss of belief in oneself, and so the resistance becomes almost entirely reactive. And that's really the problem. That's why you have it's also in the nature of progressivism to be very offensive, in the sense that it's always on the offense. It's always attacking the traditions. It's always attacking the own civilization. And so the conservative resistance to that is always playing defense, basically. Instead of coming up with its own vision. Now, that's something that has started to change a little bit. And people talk about the new Republican Party and everything like that, as opposed to the old establishment and so on. Now, I think that distinction is a bit overwrought, and I think people kind of exaggerate when people, this cult of personality that has developed around Trump, people kind of exaggerate his conservative credentials to a considerable extent, I would say. But there is this new idea now of the Republicans, of the conservative resistance, having their own vision of things, a positive view of the world. But until very recently, it was almost purely reactive toward the progressive left.
Just real quick, because I like so much what you just said.
Yeah.
Is it possible? It's almost kind of a delusion, if you want, both on the right and on the left, which is that what makes Trump attractive to so many, and I would include myself in that, is not that he's a staunch conservative or a staunch Republican, but that he is confident. So it then appears as, he appeals to conservatives and Republicans because he himself is so conservative. But in fact, he appeals because whatever his positions are, you look at this man and say, okay, he really believes in those positions. And if we go back just a little bit, John McCain, Mitt Romney, you always had the sense of they were Republicans and conservatives, but they didn't really believe in their own conservatism. For me, it's a little bit like the current Pope, who I'm not entirely sure if he's actually a Catholic. So he represents something, but you say, well, I mean, and if of course then the main representative of your ideology seems not to believe in that ideology, then it's much harder for the followers and those who kind of want to see that ideology to gain power, much harder to then follow these individuals. And with Trump, it's like, sure, he's kind of soft on abortion, and he was for same-sex marriage before Barack Obama was for same-sex marriage and all things. But the bits and pieces where he is a conservative, like he honestly stands for them, he honestly believes them, he has confidence, and you want to surround yourself, or you want to be around somebody who's confident. It's like Osama bin Laden's famous saying that if people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they are automatically attracted to the strong horse. And do you think that this might be something, surprisingly, going back to this theme I have talked about a little bit now, which is this the delusional representation of Trump as this conservative Republican, which he is not, but he's definitely somebody who's very confident in his positions.
And that illusion exists on both the left and the right, because obviously the left paint him as some kind of an extreme radical ideologically, which he's not at all. And then you see all of these people who worship Trump on the right, and which, I mean, I'll be voting for Trump definitely, but I'm not a part of the cult of personality, and who think that he's much more conservative than he is. They can't entertain as you mentioned, abortion. They can't entertain the possibility of any compromise on abortion, and yet somehow Trump is the perfect candidate for them, precisely because, as you say, he exudes confidence. You mentioned Mitt Romney. That's a perfect counterexample. When he was running and people attacked him for being rich and not for being not caring for the common man and so on, the Trump response to that would have been something like, yes, I am rich, and that's part of what's great about America, because I was able to make a lot of wealth through our free markets, and anybody can do it. It would have been a positive kind of response, whereas what Mitt Romney did, he was sort of trying to play down his own wealth and say like, well, it's not really like that at all, and I also had to struggle, but et cetera. And so he was very defensive about it. Whereas Trump, right away, I mean, he brags about how many millions or billions he has. Right. And so that's something that people find attractive. And that's been a big misunderstanding from many on the right, namely that people will only like us if we are more and more like them. Trump knows, well, he's not like other people, but he exudes confidence and he cares about people. At least that's the impression. I actually think it's true, but that's also the impression that he gives. And there's a great line in de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, from the second volume. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's basically it's something to the extent that poor people or regular people, they don't need rich people's money. They just want their respect. And that's something that a lot of people have not understood, both on the left and the right. And the appeal of someone like Trump is that he gives respect in the sense that he talks to people normally. He doesn't condescend to them, which people both on the left and the right have done by saying what they think the people want to hear. Trump really says what he thinks, at least that's how he comes across. And that's something that people understand and appreciate, and that exudes strength. And that's true on an individual basis as well. People who say what they think, they're not always liked, but they tend to be respected. And that is something that again exudes confidence. That's something that's very useful. That is also helpful toward creating a more positive vision, as we discussed, and it's not and moving away from what is purely a defensive or reactive position on the part of the right. But whether that's going to continue is an open question.
Do you think it's fair to say, just if we stick a little bit to American politics, that there was also this perception for many, definitely for me, that a significant part of the Republican Party, but also the intellectual right, if you want to use that term, has kind of made their peace with the fact that they will forever write, graceful concession speeches.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so, they will no longer win an election, but they will then give great speeches as to why they lost the election and why they wish their opponent all the best.
Mm-hmm.
It's, many people whom I still respect and still like, Jonah Goldberg, for example, or others of the Bulwark, the Dispatch, interesting publications.
Yeah.
But all publications that I feel are more concerned, and now we come back to what you said originally, they are more concerned with their moral purity than winning elections, to put it bluntly. And at some point, of course, one has to ask the question, and this brings us back to what we said before, that moral purity might be awesome and makes you feel good about yourself, but it's also a sign of weakness, because you're not winning election with it, and you're not going to affect the broader political development or direction of a country. And I think this is what we saw on the right until Trump came along. So whatever the legacy of Trump is going to be, and whether or not he's going to be reelected in the fall, I think he definitely reignited a belief on everybody right of center, not just in the United States, I think in Europe as well, that says, wait a moment, actually you can win elections. Actually, whether or not you can change then the political system or not, that's a separate topic about the deep states and the bureaucracy that has been socialized and marinated in left-leaning thought. But nonetheless, it is still possible to get into office and then maybe at some point also get into power and change things. And this division also on the right, where you have the kind of the defeatist intellectuals, David French would also be one, right? When you look at all the major issues of the past, at some point, there was always then National Review saying, okay, that's not the hill we want to die on. So it started with same-sex marriage. All right, that's not the hill we want to die on. Then it was Obamacare. That's not the hill we want to die on. And so it's every issue, it's not the hill we want to die on. And again, Trump might be pragmatic, but at least there is a sense that within his pragmatism, he's striving towards a goal and he's not willing to constantly play by the rules that are put upon him by the left. Whereas with the entire right until the age of Trump, one had the sense that they like to talk on occasion like a conservative, but they speak conservatism as a second language and don't really believe in it themselves. Or if you look at Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom, Friedrich Merz in Germany, I mean, nobody really believes that they are conservatives or that they're truly right of center.
Right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. But of course, then that leads to a new kind of moral purism. Everything always decays very quickly into its opposite. You're absolutely right that Trump does represent this kind of this pragmatism, this defeat of moral purism, and this desire to actually fight and to win elections, which is part of why people love him. But now, of course, that has led to this new moral purism in the Trump camp, if you will, not necessarily on the part of Trump himself, but from many of the people around him. And we see this, of course, in J.D. Vance. You have a lot of these new Trumpian moral purists who rake the Republican Party over the coals for ever having signed a bipartisan bill or anything like that with the Democrats. And they say that anybody who says that J.D. Vance was a bad pick from a political point of view is, he's not one of us and he might as well go with the Democrats. And so this is now this new moral purism, which again is in the camp that went against moral purism. Whenever any new movement kind of approaches power or becomes successful, of course, it's going to lead to that once again, or to a new decayed form of that. And the fact that if some of us dare to say that, okay, well, J.D. Vance is not a bad guy, but maybe another pick would have been a little more, could have been a little more conducive to getting some of those independent voters in the middle. It doesn't mean that obviously that one wants to sacrifice conservative principle, but one simply understands that winning and being able to push through some conservative principles is better than being a moral purist and losing. And so that unfortunately happens on both sides. I mean, both pre and post Trump, and both left and right, unfortunately, that moral purism, because that is what victory does to people. Unfortunately, it's human nature. But no, otherwise I would agree that certainly the rise of Trump has been a defeat for moral purism, which is good overall. Yeah.
Do you think that on all sides of the island, as a general societal phenomenon, do you think that we have a lack of self-awareness?
Well, lack of self-awareness, I would say, is I would have to think which age or society did have self-awareness. I'd be hard-pressed to find one. I mean, to have self-awareness, I guess it depends a little bit on what you mean by self-awareness, but to have self-awareness, it's useful to be up against the wall, if you will, because that has a sense of, that tends to sort of crystallize things, crystallize the reality. I would say probably a society like Israel right now is one of the more self-aware societies, at least within the West, because they have to be. And the far left has been completely destroyed basically in Israel because of, there's still a left, but there's really not a far left anymore because of reality. But I guess, yeah, maybe I should ask you a little more what you mean by self-awareness, but I don't think we're particularly self-aware now.
Well, let me put it this way, because I've been thinking about this also, and I know it's probably too general a term, but one of the things I enjoy about the 19th century particularly, and also parts of the 20th century until everything started to break down, is you had if you look at publications at the time, if you look at the emergence of comedy and these things, but it's Nestroy in Austria-Hungary, but you had the same, you had Samuel Johnson in the United Kingdom. So, and I think humor is always a fairly good indicator of self-awareness. That it's still a serious issue, but there was actually, I think, at least for Germany, I know that you could even go back to the time of Frederick the Great, right? The kind of, even from the political establishment, there was a certain tolerance towards satire, towards irony. So there was a sense that the world is a tough place, but you can take it with a sense of humor. And I think there was a long conversation that Frederick the Great once had about freedom of universities and intellectualism, and his answer was, when they said, well, you cannot just allow these people to say whatever they want, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing, and it sounds probably much better in German, right? He says, well, there are already enough idiots in Berlin, so a few more won't do any harm. But that was kind of a very this was not moral purism in a sense. Like, again, I don't want to now glorify these historical figures, but there seems to have been a certain lightness until things got dark that we no longer have nowadays. Again, I don't want to be overly nostalgic for the past, but I think there are elements of the past that are worthwhile looking at in greater detail and saying, okay, maybe there was something particularly positive about it. Because nowadays, one thing that has died, I think, is humor. But if you look at movies, if you look at late night shows, if you look at comedy, I mean, even if you think about the 1990s, I mean, how many sitcoms and TV shows that were super popular in the 90s could you no longer produce today? Even some lame ones, like Friends, if you want. But there were jokes in there. If you watch it today, instinctively you could no longer make that joke today. And I would say that might be a gradual loss of self-awareness. If even things that might be hurtful but funny, you say, oh, yeah, you better not say this. And this is what I kind of mean by self-awareness.
Right. Yeah, no, in that case, yeah, definitely. So I would say self-awareness is something, then, if we're going to look at it from a more kind of a historical perspective, then I guess I would say it's something that happens. A civilization, I don't think, has it very much maybe in its earliest days, because conservatism reigns supreme in its early days, which is also not very conducive to humor. Like those extremes, right? Conservatism and extreme progressivism, neither is conducive to humor. You do have this sort of self-awareness in this sense, I would say, arising once a civilization has grown comfortable, so to speak. So in that sense, I would actually that would be quite different from what I said before about having one's back against the wall. In this sense, having one's back against the wall is not so conducive to this type of self-awareness, because things are very serious in those days. But if you look at the rise, I mean, again, we could use Athens as an example. When does comedy come to the fore in Athens? And that is at a time when it's not late, once Oikophobia has really set in, but it's also not early, it's not early 5th century, when things are still very precarious and the Persians are invading and everything like that. Athens has become comfortable. It has established an empire. It's wealthy. It feels secure, and so on. But moral, and then Aristophanes comes around, and not only Aristophanes, but he's the most famous one, and starts to poke fun at Athenian society. So there's a certain safety in comedy, in the sense that society, and as you say, Frederick the Great, right? He has this feeling, we're strong enough that we can afford this. We can poke fun at ourselves, and in that sense, yes, that is a type of self-awareness. Then, of course, once Oikophobia sets in, then this leads to this sort of moral purism that is no longer very conducive to comedy. So in that sense, which is an interesting way of looking at it, in that sense, self-awareness has its own place as well, I would say, on the civilizational trajectory, which can be quantified to some extent, at least. And as you say, I think we've lost that. I mean, and if you look at the United States, we mentioned before, when was our peak? I mean, so maybe our peak was shortly after World War II, 1950s, thereabouts. But as you say, with the end of the Cold War, 1990s, we were unchallenged. There was a brief moment in time, basically about a decade or so, when the United States was entirely unchallenged, and one could afford this kind of self-awareness. Now, once again, we've started to move away from that. Yeah.
I have kind of two last quick questions. The first one, do you think that oikophobia is a specific Western phenomenon, or do you think that all civilizations were affected by it at some point in the history?
Yeah, so I talk a little bit about that in the book. It's not exclusively, but mainly a Western phenomenon. And the reason for that is that in order for oikophobia to occur, there has to be a fairly open intellectual space. There has to be not necessarily democracy, but there has to be a certain sense of egalitarianism, a certain sense of human worth. And again, an intellectual space where intellectuals feel free to meet and discuss with each other and to criticize the establishment, the powers that be, without too much fear of repercussions from the state. And those are things that have been, those are circumstances that have obtained much more in the West than in the East. And so for that reason, oikophobia is much more of a Western phenomenon. You still find it in Eastern societies as well, but that's more of, or Eastern African, as the case may be, but that's more as a result of direct contact with the West. So an example I mentioned in the book, because I have personal experience with it, is African oikophobia, for example. So obviously Africa, like every continent in the world, is becoming westernized and becoming more modern, both technologically and also in terms of certain ideas. And so you have someone from a tribal African village who then travels to the capital city of his country, which is much more westernized, and gets into contact with computers and cars and movie theaters and all of these things. Then returning back to his ancestral village, looks with greater disdain upon those traditional ways once he has been exposed to Western influence. And so that is a very common thing. And you find that in Africa, you find it in India, you find it in lots of different places. That sort of oikophobia that comes as a direct result of Western influence. But in terms of oikophobia starting as a more homegrown intellectual movement, that is much more of a Western thing than a non-Western thing. Yeah.
All right. On that note, Benedict, Dr. Beckeld, thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to your future projects and hope that we can talk again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.